Coming up on episode 53 of Omnivore, breaking down the ultra-processed foods debate, the race to reformulate food dyes, and forecasting changes in the dietary guidelines. This is Omnivore, from the editors of Food Technology magazine and the Institute of Food Technologists.
This episode of Omnivore is brought to you by IFT membership. Connect with our diverse community and discover a world of new opportunities. Explore the benefits of membership at ift.org/membership.
Welcome to Omnivore from IFT and Food Technology, where we explore the intersection of business, science, and technology in the global food system. I'm Bill McDowell. When Brazilian epidemiologist Carlos Monteiro coined the term ultra-processed foods and introduced the NOVA classification system in 2009, he started a movement that has had far-reaching ramifications in the food system. From day one, it's been controversial, as many scientists struggle with the seemingly arbitrary nature of the system's classifications and groups, denoting healthy versus unhealthy foods. Food scientist Matt Teagarden recently spoke with Food Technology's Mary Ellen Kuhn to break down why this approach to evaluating food and nutrition comes up short, and advocate some ways the model might be improved.
Hi, Matt. Welcome to the Omnivore podcast.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. Really glad to be here.
For 2024, Merriam-Webster says that polarization is its word of the year. So I'm going to use that word in my very first question, or a version of it. What made you want to tackle the polarizing topic of ultra-processed foods in a food tech article?
Well, that's a great question. And thanks again for having me on. I think food scientists and people working within the science of food need to have a deeper understanding of how ultra-processed foods are currently being defined and what the implications of that could be. I think as a food professional myself, this debate around processed foods has been going on forever, it seems, right? And I think it's easy to write off the hullabaloo about ultra-processed foods. It's easy to maybe write it off as another headline-seeking term that doesn't really mean anything, but there's a real scientific debate here that's happening at the forefront of public consciousness. So I think as a profession, we need to be aware. Everyone has opinions about food and not many people know the science, right? And so I think that's why it's important for food scientists to really have a voice here.
Well, it's definitely such a big issue. And your article is really a very, very careful consideration about the NOVA food classification, which characterizes food on the basis of level of processing, as we know. You've got some issues with it, which we'll get to. but I thought it would be interesting perhaps to start out by asking you if you think anything good in terms of public health is coming from this whole food classification system.
I think that's a good question. It's also good to, as a food scientist, take a step back because I can be quite passionate about this topic, and I can often have a very emotional reaction to it. But I think, taking a step back, the jury is still out on whether NOVA itself can improve public health, right? This is still a very new area of science. And there's a lot of theory out there and not a ton of data. But I do think that, if we can speak a little bit more esoterically, there are some aspects of the conversation that NOVA and the concept of ultra-processed foods has spurred that, it's resulted in some interesting research questions. And I think that those ultimately are beneficial. So questions around what aspects of food can influence our eating behaviors and what impact would changing these eating behaviors have on our health?
So in your article, you identify some of the limitations in the kinds of follow-up research that's happening. So what are some of the ways that this system of food classification comes up short, in your opinion?
That's a great question. And I think the way that we are choosing to research food with NOVA is difficult for me to understand because the definition of ultra-processed foods under NOVA is just incredibly, incredibly broad. And it does not align with our decades of evidence-based nutrition research, right? So you'll have things in certain categories like, whole wheat bread that you buy from a store might be considered ultra processed, whereas whole wheat bread you buy from an artisan baker might just be considered processed and therefore healthier. Well, we don't really have good evidence to say that one of those is actually healthier than the other. We know that there's benefits of whole grain bread, period. And so that's the data that, my mind, we should be following, right, to research food and health. But you'll also have instances where, you'll have things like olive oil and butter and lard grouped into the same category when we know that there are nutritional differences there, but Nova would say that they're equally healthy. And so I think that some of the follow-up research that's been done with Nova tends to test the more extreme versions of foods. So they might compare an ultra processed meal that's a literal fast food meal, but then the minimally processed counterpart won't be the same foods, just prepared differently. It will be completely different foods. And so the breadth of these different categories is a real hindrance to Nova, and I think would really hinder its implementation at a larger scale as well.
Well, let's talk about the kind of research that you feel does need to happen to follow up and to be really valuable.
I think first and foremost, we need a better definition. So I personally, the idea of something being ultra processed, I think I understand the ethos of it, but I don't necessarily understand how we can define that. So I think we need to get like food scientists and nutritionists and public health experts in a room, right? We need all these disciplines to talk to each other, because in the end, we're going to have to work together to develop solutions. And so I think there needs to be a better definition that's sort of arrived at by a scientific community rather than one discipline. So I think that's the first thing I would do. I also am really intrigued by some of the epidemiological studies that have been coming out that, they'll look at exposure to ultra processed foods and different health outcomes, but they'll go beyond just looking at ultra processed foods as a whole and start to break ultra processed foods down into meaningful food categories so you can understand some of the nuance within the ultra processed food category. And when you do that, you start to see that maybe some of the foods here are potentially problematic for this health outcome, but others might be beneficial, others might be benign. And so we need to understand that nuance.
So all ultra processed foods are not created equal.
Exactly. I mean, I think the proof will be in the pudding, but so to say, but it's very, very plausible from a scientific standpoint that they're not created equal, because literally they're all very different, right? And so it's impossible in my mind. I would be so surprised if there was one link that linked all these ultra processed foods together to make them universally unhealthy. I think that's really unlikely.
Well, obviously, this is a very, very big issue for the food industry. How should processed food companies be responding at this point?
So I think it's hard to have like a one size fits all answer here. I do think it's important to partner with organizations like IFT or like the International Food Information Council or the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences to advocate for stronger science here. I think it's also just important at this point to stay on top of the research here. It's a rapidly evolving space, and if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, where clinical trials that are being performed are registered right here in the US and even globally, there's dozens of them in that database. If you search ultra processed foods, there are dozens of studies that show up. So there's going to be a lot of research coming out here. And so I think it's just important to kind of stay on the forefront of that, understand the implications of it. And I think really monitoring at this point is a great first step to take.
That makes sense. And it's always so difficult to look into a crystal ball, but nonetheless, I'm going to ask you where do you think this is all headed? Will consumers ultimately radically change their diets because of concerns about ultra-processed foods? And will the Nova food classification system be a catalyst for major changes?
My mind goes like 1,000 different directions here. And, I think there's a few ways that I'll answer this. So to address your first question about whether or not consumers would radically change their diets all at once, I think for me, it's hard to see that happening overnight, at least. And I'm kind of talking in generalizations here. Maybe certain segments of consumers would, but we have currently very pretty simple, relatively accessible, well publicized, scientific based dietary guidelines, and people don't follow those, right? Like we have a roadmap that should work generally well for a lot of the population to reach a relatively high standard of dietary health, and people still don't follow them, right? So changing public behavior is really difficult. And data that's come out of the International Food Information Council, they do a yearly food and health survey. So at least in the US, taste and price are still sort of the top purchasing drivers for a lot of foods. That being said, healthfulness is not last, and actually for people that are at higher incomes, healthfulness outranks price. So there are segments of consumers that are really paying attention to health, and so I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if eventually health and health concerns sort of gradually increased in importance across all consumer segments. But the UPF debate, I think, has highlighted a lot of these aspects that people are going to start paying attention to. But I don't see it being a radical shift just because, we have tried to implement dietary guidelines and they're still just really poorly followed.
Things don't happen overnight.
No. I will say, though, I think Nova really already has shaped the future of food in a way by just introducing the concept of ultra processed foods. It didn't exist before Nova, right? So Nova brought that into existence, and it's everywhere now. And as a food scientist, it can be kind of frustrating because scientists in all sectors, academia, government, industry, are using the term without understanding that we don't have a great definition of it right now. And so it's kind of being thrown around there. I think it can help provide some sort of legitimacy to decisions that might be based on misinformation or low information. And so I think the really important thing right now is to arrive at an interdisciplinary agreed upon definition of how we want to look at food and like food processing and health in order to actually have research done that can influence and provide real targets for improvement if there needs to be any.
Matt Teagarden is a food scientist with expertise in food, nutrition, and health. He shares his thoughts on ultra-processed foods and a critique of the NOVA classification system in the February issue of Food Technology. We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment, but first, this word from our sponsor.
IFT is the convener of the global food system. As a member, you'll cultivate your professional network within our global community, stimulate new ideas with the latest research and trends, and accelerate your growth with expert training and resources. Why wait? Visit ift.org/membership to join IFT today.
Welcome back to Omnivore. I'm Bill McDowell. Just last month, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration announced that it was revoking authorization for the use of food, drug, and cosmetic red number 3 dye in food and beverages, beginning in 2027. This gives food and beverage manufacturers a little less than 2 years to reformulate. Food Technology's Deputy Managing Editor Kelly Hensel spoke with IFT's Food Science and Technical Services Manager Renee Lieber about why such reformulations can be challenging and what manufacturers need to keep top of mind when adjusting colors in various applications.
Thank you, Renee, for joining me to talk a little bit more about food colors and food color substitutes. And I wanted to start out by just kind of clarifying a couple things. In January, the FDA announced that it's banning red dye number 3, giving manufacturers 2 years to comply. So I wanted to understand from your perspective what the significance of this ban is.
So what this basically means for companies is that if you have red 3 in any of your products, you have 2 years to do that reformulation process. And while it might seem like a long timeline for reformulations, it can take quite a bit of time. A lot of companies are going to have to really start moving on the reformulating of the products, especially if it's throughout quite a bit of their portfolio.
So how prevalent is red dye number 3 in foods and beverages today? Do you have an estimate, or are there suitable replacements out there that are comparable in functionality and price?
So red 3 is by no means our most common of these synthetic colorants. Our top 3 are red 40, yellow 5, and yellow 6. But red 3 is in hundreds of products throughout the US. And so some of the categories that are most impacted are going to be our candy and confection companies and our bakery and baked good companies. And we'll see that impact quite a bit within those categories. And with that, you're going to see companies try and reformulate products quickly. Companies that use red 3 probably have it in more than one formulation. So you're going to see companies have to really revise a lot of their portfolio. One of the easy hits is to simply switch over to red 40. That's another synthetic. It should work in a wide variety of applications. But now would be the time for companies to really think to themselves, is this a time when I want to make multiple changes? Is this a time where I want to go clean label? Is it a time where I maybe want to go with a reduced ingredient statement? Whatever the case might be, and really push as many of those reformulations through at once. That way you don't have to keep opening this project and changing your product. Yeah. And so with that, I think we'll also see an uptick in companies that choose to go to the naturally based colors. I think we'll see more in the way of beet juice. I think we'll see some black carrot coloring, elderberry. There's quite a few out there. Red is one of our categories where, from a natural colorant perspective, it's a little bit easier to hit than many of our other colors. So that'll help.
Obviously, the FDA's announcement will ban red number 3 across the entire country. But California has some other legislation that was recently passed banning all 7 certified food colors. So in addition to red number 3 across the state, they're banning the remaining 6 certified food colors within schools by the beginning of 2027. So that means that manufacturers are going to have to look at not just taking out red number 3 or replacing red number 3, they're going to have to look at replacing the other 6 certified food colors in at least some of their products. So I wanted to ask you, what do certified synthetic colors bring to foods and beverages that product developers may find a challenge in replicating without them?
So synthetic colors are easy to work with, and I don't know if I can stress that enough. They're vibrant, they're pretty, they're eye-catching, they're so easy to blend. So if you want a very specific orange, let's say, you can easily blend your reds and your yellows. It's going to be exactly what you expect. Works in a wide variety of applications. So it's not something where you would look at a pH of your standard product and then have to think about what it will be doing to these colors. So they're easy for developers. They last a long time on the shelf. You don't necessarily have to worry about your product dimming in color in the same way that we see with some of our naturally derived colors over shelf life. They tend to be less expensive. So when you combine all of those things together, that gives you a pretty good picture of why they're so prevalent in certain categories. Switching into some of the naturally derived colors, the problems become that vibrancy tends to diminish. And so you got to really know your customer. Is it okay if maybe that red is a little bit darker, a little bit less vibrant? If your blue is maybe a little bit more purple, these colors don't really blend very easily. Sometimes they do things you don't think they necessarily will in products. So adding a red and a yellow doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the orange that you're expecting, which sometimes can be a fun surprise for people. They tend to be a little more expensive. In a lot of cases, they're very dependent on the variables within the product they're going to be used in. So if you have a product that has a very high pH, for some of these, you're going to get a very red color. But as that pH goes a little bit more towards neutral, that red is going to come down into a more magenta color. And so for groups that are looking to make these replacements, it's not often a one-to-one, and you really have to do a lot of research and a lot of trial and error.
But what are some tips for product developers facing this that you may offer them?
Yeah, so my first tip would be know your consumer, know exactly what they're looking for. I'm going to use an example of, let's say you have a red icing. Know how red your icing needs to be.
Yeah.
It might be very, very vibrant with synthetics, and that might not be a possibility when you switch to a naturally derived product. And so if your consumers are able to accept the fact that it's going to be a little bit darker, a little bit less vibrant, potentially a little bit more magenta, great. That'll make your life a little bit easier. The last thing you want, though, is to have customers who are no longer going to buy your product because they feel like the quality has gone down, the color is not right, this isn't matching their expectations. So really knowing what that expectation is going to help in the long run, and it's going to allow you to understand what target needs to be hit. Okay. And then hopefully that Venn diagrams with what targets you're able to hit. The other one with that I want to mention immediately is knowing the necessary shelf life, because shelf life tends to be impacted when moving from synthetic to naturally derived colors, because these colors tend to kind of dilute over time. They'll get a little bit less vibrant, less colorful. A lot of them diminish. And so knowing what that shelf life has to be, as well as how much color change your customer will happily allow within the product, is going to be super helpful.
So what kinds of innovations, since obviously the food industry is always innovating, and this in a way is another opportunity for more innovation. So what kind of innovations are happening in the food color space that could open up new opportunities for developers?
So one of the big things we're seeing right now is color blending with companies, where oftentimes if you go to blend two colors, it doesn't necessarily turn out the way you think it will. So we see colorant companies doing that work, blending those colors, and then marketing them for specific applications. So perhaps it's a baked good where you're looking for a redder color that's going to last through shelf life for your red velvet cake. Mm-hmm. They might have a solution that has 3, 4, 5 different reds in there to make sure that it's the proper red that you're looking for, that it will hold as long as possible in shelf life, that if maybe there's a red that's more vibrant in there and starts to kind of diminish, you have the reds underneath that are holding it in an acceptable color range. And so we're seeing a lot of those color blends come onto the market, and that's really making some of these reformulations easier on companies. There's still at times going to have to be some modifications, but it might get companies closer than if they start with one or a few different colors and then see how those colors interact in their products.
Got it.
And then make the modifications from there.
Speed up the timeline a little bit. Anything helps.
Absolutely, yes.
Before joining IFT, Renee Lieber spent a decade in R&D and product development at US Foods, Freshway Foods, and Jenny's Splendid Ice Cream. Renee currently leads the IFT Concierge Service, helping teams across the globe find solutions to everyday product development challenges. You can read more about the changing landscape of food color regulations and innovations in the February issue of Food Technology. Every 5 years, the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans are updated to reflect the latest recommendations on how Americans should eat and drink for optimal health. A joint effort of the U.S. Agriculture Department and the Department of Health and Human Services, the DGAs reinforce the critical link between diet and disease prevention. The scientific report from the 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee has been submitted to the USDA and HHS, and the new guidelines are expected to be published by the end of this year. While there might not be any groundbreaking changes in this year's recommendations, University of Minnesota's Joanne Slavin tells Food Technology's Julie Larson-Brisher that there might be a few wrinkles to keep an eye on.
Well, hi, Joanne. I'm looking forward to our conversation today on the 2025-2030, Dietary Guidelines for Americans.
They just keep coming up every 5 years.
I know, right? Well, what's new in the most recent DGAs and what does it mean?
Yeah, I think it's kind of really confusing because there's the advisory council, and then the officials come out, but you have this advisory report that's done right now. So I think part of it is people expect huge things to change. It's like, oh, everything's going to change. Science can't move that fast. So it's basically, have there been big changes? And there really haven't been. So the usual things since 1980, every 5 years, they're going to be the same. Eat a variety of foods, make sure you modify your weight to be consistent, and then kind of the nutrients of concern come up, and then the nutrient watch outs. So the watch outs are going to be the same, and they are added sugar, solid fats, and sodium, and then the nutrients of concern we don't get enough of: calcium, vitamin D, fiber, and potassium. So, and when people say nutrients have gone away, all we do is food patterns. We do food patterns to bring in nutrients. So it's a lot to keep track of. And I think that's the hard thing about dietary guidelines. People think they're going to change and they're going to be completely different. The basics of good nutrition, moderation, and variety will never go away.
Yeah, well, what are the 2 or 3 main areas that stand out to you?
Well, I'd say one of the big areas, and people, this has been going on, and I'm a fiber person, so I've been pushing plants my whole life, but I also grew up on a dairy farm, and I've been eating animal products my whole life and putting diets together. If you look at my plate, generally it's this putting all these things together that bring nutrients together and bring them forward. So now people say, hey, they're promoting vegetarian diets, and it's like, well, there is a shift towards that, and that's kind of consumer preferences too, that plant proteins are better for us than animal proteins. That's really hard information to get at, because a lot of the animal proteins, not only are they high quality proteins, but they also bring other nutrients: calcium, vitamin D, iron, these nutrients of concern, especially for kids. And the dietary guidelines like 10 years ago started including under ages of 2, which makes it really hard. We don't want to get that wrong. So that's where protein is incredibly important. And a lot of the animal proteins bring together these nutrients. So often people are like, oh, they're beating up on animal products and red meat and processed meats. They're just trying to bring the science forward. So those are not going to get kicked off the plate. The idea is to get more fiber and more plants in the diet, and we can all work together. So I think that's where people are like, when you look at where people are like, hey, they're going to get rid of animal proteins and animal products. They aren't. They're just saying, let's not overconsume it, because that's usually the issue we get into.
Right. Well, and the other hot topic right now is ultra processed foods, of course. Well, people kind of drop off processed foods from category 3 from the NOVA classification, but really UPFs is the buzzword, right? So, and it seems like the DGA committee didn't really address UPFs in the new guidelines. Why do you think that's so? And do you think they should have?
Well, if you go back, so much of this process is very involved. They did ask a question on ultra processed foods. So there was a question on there with weight. And so they went through the whole data set and said, okay, we are the scientific advisory committee for this question. And what we find is there's a lot of things we don't know about ultra processed foods. We haven't even agreed on a definition. So even the NOVA definition has moved forward and everybody's jumped on board, but really important foods, yogurt, white bread, whole wheat bread, are in NOVA category 4. And so are we going to tell people don't eat these nutritious foods? I've spent my whole life trying to get nutrients into the food supply. And a lot of it too, in the processing world, we can take out sodium, we can put in fiber, we can put in whole grains with processing. So there's no question that as far as nutrition, processing is really important. And then the other really big thing is food safety. So we forget that processing, and so often people that are on the Dietary Guidelines Committee have no background in agriculture or have ever worked in a food plant or understand how to make food. And all food has to be processed. So an example, when we go back to the plant proteins, if we want plant proteins to be on the center of the plate, they have to be ultra processed. Because there isn't that much protein in plants normally. So to get that protein concentrated and upgraded, we have to process it. So I think that's the other problem, is to say, hey, let's get rid of all ultra processed foods. That's easy when you're on a computer model and you're modeling, but in the real world, really appreciate one of my former students, Julie Hess, publishing this paper on modeling ultra processed foods, and that you can put together a dietary guidelines recommended diet, get all the nutrients you need with ultra processed foods that are convenient, taste good, are food safe, and economical. So this is the thing with ultra processed foods, to use that as our hammer and say, get it out of the food supply. It's like, no, that's an interesting area that's moving forward, but what's the mechanism? So if we believe that ultra processed foods are bad for us, what's the mechanism? And we just don't have any data like that. So people say, well, they just punted on it. And it's like, no, they actually did a really good review of it and said at this point, it's a developing area. Consumers are interested. We are interested in that, but we're not going to make a recommendation that we need to avoid all ultra processed foods just because there's a link to some dietary disease states. We can't go there. So it's not going to go away. It's really important. But to convince consumers that if they don't want to cook, processing is their friend. And ultra versus minimally processed versus appropriate processing, it's different for every bit of our food supply, whether we're talking about grains, animal products, plant protein. There's appropriate processing for all of those to make sure that foods are accessible, culturally appropriate, things people like to eat too. So I think that's why it's kind of probably the big news out of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is they punted on that. They didn't bother. They actually, if you read it, there's some pretty good information that they took it very seriously. They know it's a big consumer trend, but they're at this point, we are not going to make a recommendation because that is not going to improve nutrition and it's not going to improve public health by going down that path.
Yeah. Well, this reminds me too, because UPFs have really been taken up by the mainstream media. So how well are we as the scientific community doing communicating like the DGA guidelines to the public, versus, how maybe we've done so with UPFs, but, and is there anything we should do differently?
Yeah, that's a really important question because I think before I was on the dietary guidelines long ago and processing was talked about, and that was 20 years ago, we were already talking about it to make sure that we understand processing and how does that affect health. So it's not new information, but I think the whole process of the dietary guidelines is incredible. It is very transparent. It allows people to come in. You bring in these experts that volunteer all their time, but what you need on that committee are people that have backgrounds in agriculture, food processing, food production, working in plants, and how we get food to the table, because most people have no concept of that. And so then it's like we can hang on something. And to me, ultra processed foods is basically junk food. It's like, hey, it's junk food. Let's get rid of it. And we need better definitions because when we have the dietary guidelines, we want to increase whole grains. We want to increase fiber. We want to make sure that kids have high quality protein. We want to make sure they have enough iron. And by taking things out of the food supply, that seems to be, let's kick it out because it's ultra processed. It's like, it's never that simple. So, and we're all experts because we eat every day. And that's where it's really important that we don't get this wrong. So I think that's what's good for people to say, hey, science has to move slowly because if it moves too fast, the basics of good nutrition, which is getting all the calories you need, high quality protein and the nutrients, and within your society. So wherever you live and your religious practices, your cultural practices, we can't be disrespectful of that. So things like high fat milk, that for certain cultures, that's the only milk they are going to consume. We got to make sure we don't discount that and say you can't have that because that is bad, because if food isn't eaten, it provides no nutrients. So if we make it so dear and so regulated that there's no enjoyment, it's not safe, what's the point? We really haven't accomplished anything. So I believe that probably I always talk about this idea that the dietary guidelines have kind of become the nutrition elite and we have all these rules that typically don't get so if people don't eat the food or enjoy the food, what have we accomplished? And the food industry is not our enemy. And I think, I'm lucky to be in a Department of Food Science and Nutrition and to grow up on a farm and still own a farm, that if people aren't making food for you, putting it in a package and selling it to you at the grocery store, it doesn't exist. So let's not be disrespectful and say all processing is bad. It's a really sad point I think we're in. And so that's why I'm glad the dietary guidelines said, we are not going to disrespect ultra processed foods because if yogurt and bread and whole wheat bread are in category 4, that doesn't make any sense. That might make sense on your computer modeling, but it doesn't make sense for improving public health and enjoying the food we eat.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Joanne, for giving us the scoop today on the 2025 DGAs. Here on Omnivore, it's been a pleasure as always. And I actually just started my own personal dietary pattern revamp in January. And I'm actually looking more closely at the DGAs than I ever did before. So this is great insight into that.
Well, I'm glad to get this out information because everybody would just make fun of it. Nobody eats according to the dietary guidelines. They're really stupid. It's an amazing process and it does affect policy. So hopefully consumers will appreciate it and realize the wheels have to turn slowly or we make big mistakes. So we don't want to do that.
Joanne Slavin is a professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and served as a member of the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. You can find her dialogue article titled The Dietary Guidelines, What's Next? In the February issue of Food Technology.
Thank you to this episode's sponsor, IFT Membership. Satiate your hunger for knowledge, connection, and career growth with an IFT membership. Discover the benefits and activate yours at ift.org/membership.
And that wraps up this episode of Omnivore. Thanks again to all our guests and my colleagues at Food Technology. Omnivore is produced and distributed by the Institute of Food Technologists. If you enjoyed today's show and want to learn more about Food Technology Magazine or how to join the conversation by becoming an IFT member, visit ift.org/membership. For more in-depth discussion about innovation in the science of food, check out IFT's other podcast, Side Dish, on the News and Publications page of ift.org. If you have comments or suggestions for future shows, just send us an email. The address is editors@ift.org. For the entire team at Food Technology and IFT, I'm Bill McDowell. Thanks for listening, and join us again for our next episode.